The North Sea separates Norway and the United Kingdom, both figuratively and literally. In 2024, at a time when the UK is grappling with the energy crisis exacerbated by Russia's escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak proposed somewhat of an obvious solution. Why doesn't the UK max out the oil reserves it has in British territories of the North Sea? This seemingly straightforward solution has been met with more controversy than you could possibly imagine. If Sunak's plans had gone to fruition, which they hadn't till the day he left office, the UK would fall short of its climate control goals. Simply, the UK is supposed to have a net zero emission by 2050. But that's exactly why Sunak wanted to issue over 100 licenses for the exploration of the North Sea reserves. Keir Starmer, the incumbent Prime Minister, believes that the main goal should be conservation, that is, the conservation of the UK's economy at a time when it is grappling with the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. So what's the solution? Should the UK end the trade blockade on Russia, or should it deplete its reserves? Better yet, why didn't they follow Norway's approach when reserves were discovered in the late 20th century? Who owns the North Sea? In a world where money is power and power is, well, power, the question of who owns the petroleum reserves underneath the North Sea couldn't be more pressing. After Russia's escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Europe imposing blockades, and the former Soviet Union halting energy reserves as a consequence, it really couldn't be more pressing of a time than 2024. Simply, the North Sea's petroleum reserves are split between Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. However, each nation's approach to harnessing hydrocarbons and natural gas reserves has been vastly different. Before we take a look at what happened in 2024, we have to go back, way back, to when it all started. The commercial extraction of oil on the shores of the North Sea goes all the way back to the 19th century when James Young, a Scottish chemist, retorted oil from oil shale. From the Scottish Midland Valleys all the way over to Weizerfeld in Germany, people had just discovered the presence of energy reservoirs. While the United Kingdom was extracting oil and natural gas from the Midland Valleys in Scotland, the Netherlands discovered its share of the reserves in 1938. More and more players were being introduced, and every country was entitled to its share. Admittedly, no nation could continue without proper licensing terms and international laws. Namely, the United Kingdom enacted the Continental Shelf Act in 1964 and started drilling into the area shortly thereafter. The United Kingdom had to deal with several setbacks before it could celebrate its share in the North Sea's oil reserves. However, 2 dry wells and a capsized ship later discovered the Viking gas field. The UK was proactive when it came to tapping into the potential of the North Sea's reserves. However, with only a sole buyer, British Gas, exploration in the British sector started to go down. Interest was not renewed until 1969, when Phillips Petroleum discovered oil in the Darnian Age chalk in Norwegian water. This prompted Amoco to explore the Montrose field, some 300 kilometers from Aberdeen. Shell entered the picture a year later when, in 1970, the energy company discovered the Brent oil field a few kilometers east of Shetland, Scotland. The boom was short-lived. In 1973, under Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel during the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. The embargo targeted Japan, the Netherlands, Canada, the United States, Portugal, South Africa, and of course, the United Kingdom. OPEC, that's the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, eventually lifted the ban a year later, but the damage had been done. There'd been a 300% surge in the price of oil, with a pre-embargo barrel costing $3 and a post-embargo barrel shooting up to $12. The first oil shock provides a pretext for what happened when Russia escalated the Russo-Ukrainian war in 2022. In response to growing tensions, the US announced 500 sanctions on Russia, the EU announced 200, and the UK announced that it would seize the export of metal, diamond, and energy. To give some context, Russia was the largest exporter of oil and natural gas to the European Union. The Russian state-owned company Gazprom exports natural gas to Europe. In 2021, it was reported that 40% of gas consumed in the EU came from Russia. Oil has never been cheap, and it never will be. The price of oil isn't purely monetary, as the first oil shock elaborated. The embargo wasn't lifted because of monetary reasons in 1974, nor was it placed because of them in 1973. Simply, the price of oil has to do with socio-economic, political, and of course monetary dynamics. But if we were to put it into a monetary context, the volatile conditions of the North Sea have made drilling hazardous, causing numerous fatalities over the past several decades. New technologies are constantly introduced to mitigate the risk, and it's been reported that drilling companies have spent a collective sum that exceeds the bill that NASA had to foot when it placed a man on the moon. While a fully functional economy is dependent on several factors, oil and natural gas, simply energy, will always be at the top of the list. But the UK shouldn't have to worry, right? It had access to reservoirs under the North Sea. While the UK couldn't fuel an entire nation on those reserves alone, it should have been enough, right? In 2001, the largest oil field in the United Kingdom was discovered in Buzzard off Scottish shores. Buzzard has reserves that equate to almost 64 cubic million meters, that's 400 million barrels worth of oil each day. Norway hit the literal jackpot just a few years later when in 2010 the Johan Sverdrup oil field was discovered in Norway's territory. Total reserves have been estimated at 2 to 4 billion barrels of recoverable oil, producing between 120,000 to 200,000 barrels of oil daily. A decline was inevitable, and in the late 1990s, the UK peaked production with 5 million barrels of oil per day to almost 1 million in 2019. Why? To put it quite bluntly, it was bound to happen. Fields age and their oil output tends to decrease, making drilling all the more expensive. This decline has shifted the focus to decommissioning old infrastructure. Decommissioning involves safely dismantling and removing offshore platforms, subsea installations, and pipelines. Since 1971, when production began, the 5 countries with licensing under the Convention of the Continental Shelf have extracted several hundreds of fields from the North Sea. For context, Norway has extracted 123 fields. By the end of 2023, 92 fields were active, 67 in the North Sea, 23 in the Norwegian Sea, and 2 in the Barents Sea. But to answer the obvious question, yes, the North Sea is expected to continue being a significant petroleum source. Some estimates suggest that there are 24 billion barrels of oil still remaining in the reservoir, and it'd take another 35 years to completely deplete the North Sea's reserves. And now, moving on to another obvious question, why hasn't the UK made use of it? The United States and its allies, one of which is the United Kingdom, have imposed a collective of approximately 2,000 sanctions on Russian institutions. These sanctions were intended to halt Russia's escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war and admittedly have had an effect on Russia's economy. The former Soviet Union saw its biggest customer for oil and natural gas in Europe, but with trade embargoes, Russian oil companies have faced a noticeable setback. But think about that again. Europe was Russia's biggest customer for energy. Where is Europe getting its energy from now? Western sanctions do work, and Gazprom has reported several losses since the 2022 escalation. That was the intended purpose, since the state-funded natural gas company would contribute towards state revenues, a major portion of which was allocated for defense. It's easy to trace it back to the source, but that doesn't mean that the West didn't just partake in mutually assured destruction. Gazprom has struggled with the consequences of decoupling from the EU market, but the oil industry has managed to weather the sanctions better, albeit with a significant loss of revenue due to heavy price discounts in Asian gas markets and sharp increases in the cost of shipping oil to Asia. The party that has suffered the most from Western sanctions, however, is Russia's state budget, which saw its revenues from oil and gas decline 24% in 2023 compared to 2022. Gazprom itself reported a revenue fall of over 40% in its year-over-year report in 2023, with sales profit for natural gas production falling by 25%. In 2024, the company reported a net loss of approximately $7 billion, its first annual loss in over 20 years. Sanctions and decoupling from European oil and gas markets have also significantly reduced Russia's ability to use energy as a tool of political pressure against Western democratic countries. But a decline in Russia's state revenue was to be expected. It was the intended purpose of the embargo. Collaterally, the countries that depend on Russia for oil and natural gas also suffered. Again, Europe was Russia's biggest customer when it came to energy. In 2023, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit reported that sanctions placed on Russia would cost the average British adult over £1,000. That's £1,000 on top of the existing cost of living crisis in the United Kingdom. So, were the sanctions worth it? Again, it depends on how you look at it. On one hand, you could argue that the UK anticipated what was coming because of the sanctions, whereas Moscow didn't. That doesn't mean that the European nation, along with all of Europe, wasn't affected. It just meant that they had to tap into other resources to make ends meet, such as North Sea's oil and natural gas reserves. A study by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit estimated that high wholesale gas prices since Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly a year ago had cost UK energy suppliers an additional £50 to £60 billion, on top of the £10 to £20 billion spent in a normal year. According to the International Monetary Fund, the United Kingdom was hit the worst in the aftermath of the Western blockade on Russia, even though the UK's official government report suggests that the situation isn't that dire. Per the IMF, however, the UK is among the least energy-efficient countries in the whole continent. It's been reported that the average British household uses gas for generating 40% electricity and 85% for heating. Something had to be done, and it had to be done promptly. This sense of urgency prompted the former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to announce that 100 licences were planned for exploration in the North Sea, as far as it fell in the UK's territory. The licensing round was initially announced by the North Sea Transition Authority in October 2022. However, Sunak's announcement signalled a growing concern that the UK government may be weakening its resolve on climate change issues. The project didn't materialise, not for as long as the Conservative Party was in office. Still, when Keir Starmer took over the reins in 2024, he reassured the public of a renewed focus on climate change and a potential re-evaluation of these policies. The Labour Party's commitment to a greener future suggests that the new administration may take a different approach to fossil fuel extraction and prioritise sustainable energy solutions. Sunak's policy was to max out the UK's fossil fuel reserve, partly to alleviate the energy crisis and to give the economy the boost it needed in a move to a greener tomorrow. Sunak's policy was met with criticism from nearly everyone, even members of his own party who criticised the then Prime Minister of conflicting with the country's climate control goals. This isn't to suggest that everyone was opposed to Sunak's ideas. In fact, proponents argued that this was a necessary step to achieve the country's goals. In fact, it couldn't be sidestepped. Even the Conservative Party and the Labour Party from 2024 onward tried. To give some context, the UK plans on reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And why wouldn't the government want to maximise on increasing domestic productions over imports? Losing track of what the country set out to do, that's why. Critics have expressed concerns, a lot of them echoed by international communities, that Sunak's plans would jeopardise the UK's climate goals at a time when it couldn't have been any more critical. The focus from 2023 onwards should be on transitioning to a low-carbon economy and not the other way round. You see, Russia's escalation of the war didn't cause the entirety of the energy crisis, it only contributed to it. The timing, however, was what caught the West by surprise. For a country that's highly dependent on fossil fuels such as the UK, the timing couldn't have been worse. It's a multifaceted challenge. How can we be energy independent when we need energy? And how can we alleviate our carbon footprint without depleting the reserves we already have in the North Sea? We already talked about how there is energy that's yet to be tapped in the North Sea reserves, but the UK made a conscious decision not to issue licenses up until very recently. Still, what difference could 100 licenses make? According to some experts, a relatively small one. You have to remember that even if the British government issues a license, there's no plausible guarantee that the project will proceed to field development. The UK doesn't have that many energy reserves left in the first place, with a reported net depletion of the reserves by 2050 anyway. Some suggest 2035. While the UK imports gas from Norway, Europe, Qatar, and the US, the carbon footprint of these imported supplies can be significantly higher than those of domestically produced oil and gas. Wait, why Norway? The United Kingdom saw a boom in oil reserves alongside Norway. No, in fact, the UK saw a boom before Norway. The largest of UK's reserve was discovered a whole decade before the largest Norwegian reserve could be located. Yet, as it stands in 2024, Norway has made use of the North Sea reserves in a way to become one of the richest countries in the world. The UK, on the other hand, didn't appreciate what it had. Simply, the nation didn't reinvest. Now, when governments are split between using the reserves and issuing licenses or not, there's contention. In any case, it wouldn't make a difference even if the UK does make use of it. We've already talked about that. What we should talk about now, though, is how Norway managed to turn around its fortunes and how the UK could have done the same. The Norwegian government had a similar strategy as did the British government when oil was discovered in the North Sea. That is, the oil would be used to make society progressively better by mitigating dependency on imports and replenishing state revenue. Admittedly, that's been the goal for every economic division globally, but Norway actually achieved it. The UK did too, but then Margaret Thatcher entered the picture in 1979 and started focusing heavily on privatisation. Britoil and BP were all privatised in the 1980s. And unlike Norway, it left the UK government with no direct ownership of oil and gas. To put this in context, the National Resource Governance Institute argues that since 1970, the UK government received around $11 a barrel. By contrast, the Norwegian government was receiving $30 a barrel. The $19 extra per barrel explains why Norway received $1.2 trillion and UK tax revenues only $400 billion. Instead of using oil revenues for immediate gains, they chose to invest them for the future. These funds were invested in international companies, including assets like Regent Street in London. Ethical considerations were also prioritised in these investments, giving Norway global influence beyond its small size. There wasn't the same rush to fund tax cuts or provide short-term political gains. Norway also approached oil production cautiously, holding back during periods of low prices and preventing a surge in the currency. The investment fund was specifically designed to be insulated from short-term political pressures, with the government restricted from spending the capital and allowed only to use a portion of the fund's income for welfare programs like education and healthcare. This approach highlights Norway's success, built on trust, strong governance, and a commitment to sharing the benefits of oil wealth. This sharply contrasts with other nations, where oil revenues have been used unsustainably to cut taxes, enrich a few, or allow multinational corporations to take the bulk of the profits. Interestingly, both Norway and the UK held referendums rejecting EU membership, with a near identical voting margin. Yes, Brexit comes into play here too. Norway took a pragmatic approach, aligning with the single market, customs union, and achieving near economic harmonisation with the EU. In contrast, the UK opted to leave both the single market and customs union. Norway, adjusted for the cost of living, enjoys the second highest levels of consumption in Europe and has successfully invested in a post-oil economy. It leads in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and heat pump adoption. While the UK has made progress with offshore wind farms, it has missed opportunities to further invest in renewable energy and upgrade its power grid. In 2020, the UK earned just £0.2 billion from North Sea oil compared to Norway's £9 billion. This disparity stems from Norway's decision to maintain state ownership of its oil and gas resources, while the UK opted for privatisation under Thatcher, allowing profits to flow to the wealthy and fueling social inequality. While the UK used its oil wealth for tax cuts and consumer spending, Norway took a long-term approach, investing its oil profits into a sovereign wealth fund, now valued at over $1.3 trillion. This fund has made Norway one of the wealthiest nations in the world, while the UK faces mounting financial burdens, including £51 billion in decommissioning costs by 2065 and over £19 billion in tax allowances for oil companies. The UK's oil and gas revenue, projected to reach £11 billion in 2022-23, could be redirected to climate change mitigation, such as upgrading infrastructure for electric vehicles and improving energy efficiency in homes. Yet some view this as a short-term fix that delays more decisive action. In a shift toward a greener agenda, Labour's plans include increasing taxes on the oil and gas sector and ending the issuance of new licenses for North Sea exploration. Industry leaders warn that this could harm jobs and investment, but Labour is committed to funding the transition to renewable energy. Starmer's government faces the task of balancing ambitious environmental goals with the concerns of the oil and gas industry while ensuring economic viability. Labour's green agenda represents a pivotal moment for the UK's future, with the potential to lead the nation toward a sustainable, low-carbon economy. Can the UK redeem the mistake it made half a century ago?